It's the Locked On Flyers podcast for Thursday, July 13th, your daily dose of Flyers news, analysis, and high quality content that is thinking, wow, what does a year make in the Flyers and where they are?
I don't know. It's like dog years, though.
Yeah, it could be. We're going to get into the differences in the team last year at this time to this year, looking at everything from management, the on ice product, how they operate off ice, all on today's show.
You're Locked On Flyers, your daily podcast on the Philadelphia Flyers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there. Thanks for making Locked On Flyers your first listen every day. I am Rachel Donner. You can find me on Twitter at rmiriam. I'm here as always with Russ Cohen, who's on all your favorite social media apps at Sportsology. And we as a show are on Instagram and Threads at Locked On Flyers as well. You can subscribe or follow us for free on YouTube. We're on Sirius XM. Anywhere you listen to podcasts, you'll get the latest episode as soon as it's available here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Russ, still no D'Angelo news yet, although that's kind of to be expected at this point with nothing coming out of Carolina with the other possibilities. So that's something we're going to get into a little bit more on tomorrow's show. So stay tuned for that.
Yep.
The more interesting news, I guess interesting is putting it mildly, is the Garnet Hathaway media availability that happened yesterday as a recording of the show, I
Yes.
guess. Yeah, so they had a Zoom availability for Garnet Hathaway on joining the Flyers, and there was a hot mic situation where the background, someone from the Flyers social media team said something negative about a question that Gianna Hahn from the Philadelphia Inquirer asked. It was a good question, by the way.
Yeah, the question was
Uh,
fine. I mean,
yeah.
sorry
So,
that that person's bored of hearing about it, but that's your job.
yeah, and especially when you are obviously a rebuilding team, when somebody joins that team of their own accord, you have to ask them what make them do that, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you have to ask.
Yeah. So a couple things. First one is I wasn't on the call because I had some things going on in my personal life, so I couldn't make it. When I did, before I heard it, I had said to somebody, boy, I really hope it's not one of the female reporters and this isn't a guy. But of course it was. So that's a bad look to begin with, because that's something like you already rolled your eyes when I said it. It's something that anybody who
Yeah.
does sports knows that there's a little bit of an issue there, or really a lot of an issue there. So that's one. So that without even knowing what was going on, I kind of knew it could be that, right? So that's bad. I do think Keith Jones handled it correctly, but it's still it's more far-reaching than that, Rachel, because what you don't know is so at the not the Stanley Cup, at the draft, we had a big Professional Hockey Writers Association meeting, and Molly Walker had probably about a 30 to 40 minute discussion, PowerPoint presentation about things that could work out better between the media and teams in this league. And there were some teams that were brought up, and sure enough, this situation arises, and she tweets about it, and I get it, because right now we're sort of in an era where that the media, there's less media, there's fewer media than there used to be, and the media is still trying to keep their foothold to get the message across to the fans. Like, that's the media's job, right? And I get it. There's some people that don't like the media. That's fine. But we all have a job to do. And you want it to be done professionally. And that was the thing, that was a big highlight of that meeting. And sure enough, what are we, a couple weeks out, and this occurs. And so, this is something that is going to be talked about a lot on Twitter with a lot of different hockey writers for a while. Not just this one situation. There's going to be others that are going to come up too. And the writers and broadcasters now are going to be a little bit more vigilant about it because there's too much of this going on.
Yeah, I think it's a very delicate situation. And again,
Yes.
glad that Keith Jones came out with a statement. I believe Danny Briere said something about it as well. As far as it being a negative interaction that will be dealt with, et cetera. But I just like it is important to have an independent media from the teams being able to share what is going on with the team.
Right.
And having an outside perspective and asking important questions like that. And so to have it be dismissed like that internally by team representatives it's not a great look, I'll say.
No. No.
So again, great question from Gianna. I thought Garnet Hathaway actually answered it really well.
He's a pro, like he did.
Yeah.
He was fine about it.
He was. And, I thought the most interesting part of that conversation, after all that went down was, switching from being a listener to a talker in the locker room and how, it's going to be a real change in who he is as a hockey player. And he's looking forward to it. And
yeah, because he could share his experiences. He's got a lot of them.
Yeah, and that, he really kind of vibed with Danny Briere and the mission of the rebuild and, having had almost no familiarity with this team whatsoever, other than playing against them, didn't really have friends on the team or anything to go off of. He still made that commitment based on what Danny Briere talked to him about. And that says a lot, I think.
It does. No, there's no question. I mean, Briere sold him on it. He liked what he heard. He wanted to be a part of it. That's good.
Yeah, I think that's all very good and speaks well on behalf of what Danny Briere is at least starting to do here.
Yes.
Which I think is a really good transition to our discussion on today's show about where the Flyers are last year at this time versus this year at this time. And I think, it behooves us to kind of go back and look at where we were last year at this time. So we were still obviously in the Chuck Fletcher era. They had hired John Tortorella on June 17th, so before the draft. And, we had talked about at the time, the timing of the hiring, when there was other potential candidates that could have been out there. We talked at length about the hiring process that we thought, maybe it could have been a little bit more strenuous or done more due diligence, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no doubt. They could have done more due diligence, doctor's reports, all kinds of different things to check on players before these kinds of deals went through. And, it's easy to rip Chuck after the fact. So I'm cognizant of what was going on at that time too. And I'm going to just say, hey, we don't know, as far as like, if we will go way back to Ryan Ellis, we don't know how much vetting there was. But I have talked about that conference call where, one of the members of the media asked him about injuries and he got mad about it. So you just kind of wonder if they had done a little bit more digging on that, would they have uncovered something? So that made me think about that after the fact, simply because the way the player, had that knee-jerk reaction. And so, yes, I would think vetting wasn't as good as it could be. And, they're paying the price a little bit for that.
Yeah, I think, it was part of the issue with the player signings as well as the Tortorella hiring as head coach. I think both of those came into play. And I think we knew that at that time. I don't think this is a 2020 hindsight thing. With
not on that, not on the Torts part, because we knew, hey, why are they doing this? If they're going to be in a rebuild,
why are they doing it now?
Why are they doing it like this? Like, we did bring up those questions. Those questions definitely occurred.
Yeah. And, we heard aggressive retool over and over and over again. And that was the mantra last year at this time. So that hiring was on June 17th. We had the draft class July 7th through the 8th. And, Cutter Gauthier was picked, which we, again, at the time and now will say it was a very good pick. And it was not the pick we would have made.
Right.
Again, the rest of the draft class was very interesting and good. Devin Kaplan is making progress. Alex Bump, as we saw at development camp this year, is making tremendous progress. So, I think that draft class is looking pretty solid so far.
I mean, I'll say that I think they can get two out of them. And that's what you look for in most drafts, is to get 2. I think there's a chance to get 3. So, long as something catastrophic doesn't happen, or, anything could happen in the world. But right now, today, it looks like there's a chance to get 3.
Yeah. So you want to give the team credit for that
Yeah.
draft class, as much as we know now, right? Still,
Yep.
jury is still out, but
Oh, yeah.
and so at that time, I think we would have thought it was a pretty decent draft class too. Not
Yes.
the greatest, but pretty solid.
Yeah. I think, again, had they gotten Juracek, it may have addressed their needs. It may have changed what happened with how they traded Provorov and everything else. Maybe they would have gone about things differently. They didn't. Hey, whatever. But that's how one pick can change the course of what you do, though.
All right. So that gets us to the draft last year. We're going to switch gears and go look at what Chuck Fletcher did in free agency last summer and see how that's stacking up now. Coming up next. Today's episode is brought to you by a product that I use almost every day, and that's AG1. Maybe you're like me, you want to be healthy and eat well, but it's always easier said than done. That's no longer the case with AG1. AG1 is a foundational nutritional supplement that delivers comprehensive nutrients to support whole body health. With one delicious scoop of AG1 in a glass of water every day, you're absorbing 75 high-quality vitamins, minerals, whole foods, source superfoods, probiotics, and adaptogens to help you start your day right. The special blend of ingredients supports your gut health, your nervous system, your immune system, your energy, recovery, focus, and aging. It can be hard and expensive to keep track of multiple supplements and vitamins, not to mention how hard it can be on your stomach. AG1 costs you less than $3 a day, and you're investing in your health. Plus, it's cheaper than your cold brew habit. Right now, it's time to reclaim your health and arm your immune system with convenient daily nutrition. If a comprehensive solution is what you need from your supplement routine, then try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first purchase. Go to drinkag1.com/NHL network. That's drinkag1.com/NHL network. Check it out. All right. Going back to where we were last summer around this time, looking at the Chuck Fletcher kind of season, which begins kind of earlier in the season, really, than in July. But if you recall, he had extended Ristolainen during the season. And then at the trade deadline, made the Claude Giroux trade, traded Justin Braun, and then traded Derek Brassard. So, we got some assets back in that. We've already had 3 draft picks that were as a result of the return on those in Denver Barkey, Igor Zavgarin, and Alex Cernak. So I think that it was an inevitable trade deadline, right? He traded away basically who we expected him to trade away. The Claude Giroux return was what it was going to be because of the no trade clause. And then, at the draft, we had the Tony DeAngelo trade and sign.
The debacle.
Yes.
And we knew it was a debacle at the time. We
did. We did. And that's the thing is so they picked Alex Gendron with the pick they got in return on that one. Interestingly, though, what Carolina got as payment was the 3rd round pick that Carolina then traded to the Sharks, who picked Brandon Svoboda, who's a good pick. But the Canes picked Jaden Perron at 94, which is where they traded down to as a result of that pick.
Which could work out very well for them.
I know. And we talked about that on yesterday's show.
We did.
So just found that really interesting when you dug into the trade tree on that.
I do want to mention the Risto thing. So at that time, I was okay with what he got paid and even the term if things were going to be successful that they were doing. Once things weren't successful with what they were doing, it's a bad sign. And so that's a GM's job, is to kind of read the landscape and say, which way is this team going? And he could have figured out at that point that it was probably pointing more towards the rebuild than to his success story that he was trying to write in being Chuck. So That's my issue with the Risto thing, because had you known then you were going to rebuild, you would not have made that signing. You would have traded him too.
Yeah, I think so. I think it was a bad signing in context.
Right.
And
It's
I
not
think
like he's making too much money. He's not. The term's a little high, sure, a little long, but he's really not making too much money. But just on a team that's in cap trouble at times, not so much now. With a rebuilding team, it's not a great look.
Yeah, and I think that free agency day was the day that it was sort of like, oh, Chuck really doesn't know what's going on here.
Right.
And there was like these little things, the Risto thing happened during the season, and so you could kind of isolate it. And then the D'Angelo trade, you're like, oh, well, that's the getting harder to play against mantra. Right. So you could sort of isolate it in that and make excuses for him if you wanted to, in context at that time. I'm not saying now, I'm saying at that time. Free agency day was just like things are going off the rails in a bad way.
No, that was a big thud.
Yeah. So we have the Nick Delorier 4-year deal, even though it's only $1.75 million per year.
I still don't get it, but it's okay. He's a good guy. He doesn't hurt the team. It's just an unnecessary cap move.
Yeah. And then, there was really nothing else to support the team in a significant way. They re-signed Justin Braun. Again, nothing against him. Love Justin Braun. But it's just like, are you trying to aggressively retool this team or not? Because everything else was Phantoms level signing.
Right.
And then, they had to do their RFA signings later. And I think really the only good thing that came out of that in a significant way was the Owen Tippett contract. It was 1.5 for 2 years. And I think that was a good contract.
No, that's a good contract. Absolutely.
Yeah. So it was kind of a lackluster, I would say, off season overall for a team that was supposedly in an aggressive retool.
Yeah, there were signs then, like, things were not going great. But then there was some fool's gold that would lay ahead.
Yeah. And it's really interesting. I went back to my Chuck Fletcher press conference notes from at that time. And, talking about seeing what the younger players can do. And we saw how that played out in terms of a couple of the guys getting like boxed out or getting like that whole system of like bringing guys up for a game or two and then sending them back down. And you can't really get a sense of how they would be at the NHL level. So some of what Chuck Fletcher had to say then just did not occur in any way, shape, or form.
No, that the spaghetti didn't stick to the wall in that case.
Yeah, I think so. But so then, I think that looking at the Chuck Fletcher era of, what he was saying and what those moves were supposedly going to portend, like we're going to get tougher to play against, we're going to take a step forward in this aggressive retool. Well, were the Flyers tougher to play against? They were 9th in the league in penalty minutes and penalty minutes per games played. And then if you look at penalties drawn versus taken, they were a -10, like on the bad side of that, in terms of they had more penalties taken than drawn overall. They were basically like 25th in the league there in that stat. And to me, that says when you get tougher to play against, you're more physical, but you know how to do it without crossing the line.
Right. That's the way it's supposed to be, on the right side of the ledger, on your side of the ledger. I would say, to be fair, they were harder to play against maybe for that first 25 games of the season. After that, not so much.
With hindsight, or without hindsight, let's say, without hindsight, do we think Chuck Fletcher was going to get fired at some point this season?
Yeah. Yeah, we knew.
Yeah, I think so. Like maybe not in July of last year.
We just didn't know if he'd get bumped up and still hold a position, because I did think he could hold the president's position. That was the only surprise to me, was they didn't do that, and I was fine with that.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Do we think it should have happened sooner or later than when it did? Because it happened March 10th.
Right.
And I think that the big mistake here was waiting till after trade deadline.
Right.
I think that was the big problem.
They gave him so much rope that they gave him that trade deadline, and he failed on the trade deadline, and then ultimately that made things worse.
Yeah, and I'm trying to think, like, last summer at this time, would I have given him through the deadline to prove himself? And I don't know. I think part of me says, yeah, maybe I would have, but also based on how things were in December, January, I wouldn't have at that
Yeah,
point.
I
I
think
think
it's a
there were,
coin flip. I think it's a coin flip, to be fair, for both of us. I'd say it was
yeah,
probably a coin flip. We were probably pretty conflicted either way.
yeah, I think so. Up until it was closer to the trade deadline, like I
Right.
said, like late December, January, where I'm like, oh, does he have what it takes and the relationships now? And are the Flyers in a position where people just aren't going to do deals with the Flyers in a meaningful way with Chuck Fletcher in charge?
Yeah, I could tell an hour and a half, 2 hours into that trade deadline, it was going to fail. I just had that feeling. I wasn't hearing anything. So I kind of knew that it was going to be this failure at that point.
Yeah. So I think that there's evidence to go either way in terms of thinking, is he going to get fired or isn't he going to get fired? And when is that going to happen? And I think that now that kind of makes us look at where the Flyers are now in terms of expectations for last season going into it versus this season. We are going to talk about the team record and everything around it coming up next.
Today's episode is brought to you by Birddogs. I look better and feel great wearing Birddogs shorts and pants. The stretchy fabric really feels good, and it's comfier than my other shorts and pants. And yeah, I wore them today doing the lawn. It was great. The it stretches in the right spots. The anti-wicking really does last, and it was hot out there. I got out there, probably was still about 85, 90 degrees. So I wear them for that. I wear them for walking the dog. I wear them for tailgating. They're good for so many situations. And they really, it doesn't have to be just in the summer. I will wear them until, it's below 60 degrees. Then I'll stop. Go to birddogs.com/LockedOnNHL and enter promo code LockedOnNHL for a free Yeti-style tumbler with your order. That's birddog.com/LockedOnNHL for a free Yeti-style tumbler. You won't want to take your bird dogs off, we promise you.
So, Russ, looking at expectations for this upcoming season versus last season, I think that expectations were pretty low for the Flyers going into this past season. I think that maybe because of a couple of other teams in the division overperforming, that maybe we thought the Flyers would end up a little higher in the division when the season was said and done. But I think it was more about what other teams did that changed the outcome as opposed to what the Flyers did or didn't do.
I think there's some of that, but there were two annoyance points for me during the season. The one was early on when Chuck was still talking about making the playoffs, which seemed to both of us pretty ludicrous at the time that he said that, but he said it, and then he didn't really have to say anything else until after the deadline, I think. But that was one that sort of hit me. And then, the other thing was, I think it was after the failed trade deadline where Chuck was saying, well, we've improved over last year by like 9 games or something. Like somebody pulled that stat out, and it's like, who cares? You're still in the mud. It doesn't really matter. And, as far as the coach goes, things changed for John too, because there was that fool's gold at the beginning of the year where they were doing really great for like that first 10, 11 games. And everybody's like, oh, look, well, maybe there's this magic. And then that went away. And then John was defending Tony DeAngelo, and then that went away. And then John realized, I want to say it was about, 10 games to go in the season, something like that, that he realized it was a much harder job than he realized when he signed on for it. Like he acknowledged that. And so that did change the way that team was being coached at that point. Because at first they were being coached like, all right, look, you're going to get into my culture. We're going to be competitive, whatever. And then it kind of changed to, okay, John realized he couldn't be the dead horse. They were going to work in some of the youngsters, and they were at least going to try and, move this forward, but it would take longer. So there was a big change there.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that it's I feel like there's at least a sense of realism right now that there wasn't, like, coming from the organization, right? Whereas like last summer with Chuck Fletcher with this aggressive retool language, I feel like everybody outside of the Flyers was like, I don't know what he's talking about, man. Like, this is
Yeah,
not realistic. Whereas I
right.
feel like the way that Danny Briere and Keith Jones and Dan Hilford, the way everybody is talking about it, that they understand where the organization is from an on ice perspective. And they're doing everything they can to make it clear that they know that this is, a longer look at getting competitive than they would have said last year under Chuck Fletcher.
Yes, I think they do get it. I do think there's that little thought, though, that they can do it faster, and they're not going to say it, although we've heard some things that got close to that early on when they took over. So I still think there's some of that. But I will tell you this. It's okay to be optimistic about what they're doing, but don't bleed that over into making what you think the team is better or thinking the team is better at this time. Because I did notice that after and I think it was whatever the service was, the betting service, they basically put the Flyers at 150 to 1. They were one of the three worst teams in the league to win the Stanley Cup, odds to win the Stanley Cup. And a Bodog, I think was the name. And so the issue there was I was reading comments and there were some people they were like, well, I thought we'd be bad, but not this bad. And so I do think there's still a portion of the fan base that doesn't believe they're one of the three or four worst teams in the league, but they are. That's what you are. If you do better than that, then yes, you've outkicked your coverage. But going into the season, you should not think that they're going to be any better than that. You could hope. I'm not trying to take away your hope, but I think you have to be realistic about it. And I think once Vegas starts showing you that, then that should be the okay. They've looked at a lot of different things here, and they don't think we're that good.
Yeah, and by Vegas, you don't mean the Golden Knights. You mean the betting.
No, I mean like the bookmakers in Vegas.
Yeah,
the stats guys.
So the Flyers were 31, 38, and 13 overall for the season this past year. And I just, especially given the way the blue line is right now, I have to think that it's not going to be any better than that. Could be worse. I just don't think that it's going to be better. Now, there is the upside of the potential upside, let's say, if Sean Couturier returns in a meaningful way, if Cam Atkinson returns in a meaningful way. But again, there's a lot of ifs attached to that, an asterisk attached to that. And so if you look at it that way, yes, I think the Flyers can get better this upcoming season. Otherwise, I think it's going to be about the same, in my opinion.
Yeah, when I looked at things about a week ago after the draft, after some of this free agency, I saw and I see maybe 5 or 6 teams that have definitely gotten better. There's a bunch that are the same, like the Islanders, and then there are others that got worse, and I put the Flyers into that mix that got worse. Now, they don't play as many in-division games as they used to, but who exactly are they better than in their division?
Yeah, there's a question to that, right? We talked about that on yesterday's show about how good everybody else got in the division. So
that's an issue right there to start.
Yeah. So I think that really the conclusion that we are coming to here is that the Flyers, I think, on the record sheet in the standings are going to be about the same. On the ice, it's going to look a lot different from a style of play, I think.
Yes.
And that's going to be the big difference. It's going to be the style of play. It's going to be trying to get some of the younger guys in there, and it's going to be a focus on player development. And I think those are important, good changes versus where we were last year at this time. Whereas last year it was put square pegs in round holes to try and Band-Aid together a team that's going to do better.
Right. And they just kept reshuffling the deck chair. So I agree with you. I think there'll be more of a focus this year.
Yeah. All right. So that's where we are now. We'll check in again as we get closer to the season to see where everything is and see if our assessment is still the same then. In the meantime, that'll do it for today's show. We'll be back tomorrow. We're going to talk more about the DeAngelo trade that maybe isn't happening and what that means for the Flyers blue line overall. Thanks for making us your first listen today. And as a reminder, we always want to hear from you. Send in your mailbag questions via Twitter at Locked On Flyers. You can email us at lockedonflyers@gmail.com or comment over on YouTube. I'm Rachel. I'm on Twitter at rmiriam. That's RMIRIAM.
I'm Russ. I'm at Sportsology, SPORTSOLOGY.
Have a great day, everyone.